What happens when a 35-year-old African president walks into a room full of world leaders and refuses to play by their rules? When everyone expects him to beg, but he arrives with a proposal that could reshape an entire continent. Today's story unfolds in the gleaming corridors of power in Riyadh, where billionaires decide the fate of nations over coffee, and one man's refusal to bow changed everything. This isn't just about money or politics. It's about dignity, respect, and what happens when someone dares to rewrite the script everyone expects them to follow. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a single conversation in Saudi Arabia sent shockwaves across 3 continents and turned a poor nation into an equal partner. Overnight, the marble floors of the King Abdulaziz Conference Center reflected the morning light like mirrors, each surface polished to perfection. Outside, the Riyadh skyline stretched endlessly, glass towers reaching toward heaven, monument to ambition and oil money. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and the subtle tension that always accompanies gatherings of the world's most powerful people. It was March 15th, and the Saudi Crown Prince's annual investment summit was about to begin. This wasn't just any business meeting. This was where fortunes were made and lost with a handshake, where entire economies could shift with a single nod of approval. The guest list read like a directory of global influence. Tech billionaires from Silicon Valley, oil executives from Houston, manufacturing moguls from Germany, and heads of state whose signatures could move mountains. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman entered the Grand Hall at exactly 9 a.m., his presence commanding immediate attention. At 38, he had already transformed Saudi Arabia's economy, launched futuristic city projects worth hundreds of billions, and positioned his kingdom as a bridge between East and West. His Vision 2030 plan was reshaping not just Saudi Arabia, but the entire Middle East. Today, he would decide which global partnerships deserved his kingdom's vast resources. The delegates have been arriving since dawn. Private jets lined the tarmac at King Khalid International Airport like luxury cars in a showroom. Each visitor had come with proposals, presentations, and promises. They spoke of renewable energy projects, artificial intelligence ventures, space exploration initiatives, and smart city developments. The competition was fierce. Everyone wanted a piece of Saudi Arabia's $2 trillion public investment fund. Among the familiar faces were some surprises. The president of Singapore had flown in to discuss semiconductor manufacturing. Brazil's foreign minister brought proposals for agricultural technology exchanges. Even the prime minister of Estonia was there, pitching digital governance solutions. But buried deep in the day's agenda, almost as an afterthought, was a name that made many attendees scratch their heads in confusion. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. The whispers started immediately. Burkina Faso, the landlocked West African nation that most people couldn't locate on a map? What could possibly bring their leader to a summit designed for economic superpowers? The country's entire GDP was barely $15 billion, less than what some attendees spent on weekend acquisitions. Their infrastructure was decades behind, their resources limited, their international influence minimal. It seemed almost absurd. "Why is he even here?" murmured the German delegation. What does Burkina Faso have that Saudi Arabia could possibly want? The answer to that question would soon reshape everyone's understanding of power, partnership, and potential. As the morning sessions progressed, presentation after presentation followed the same predictable pattern. Sleek PowerPoint slides, impressive statistics, polished executives in $1,000 suits making carefully rehearsed pitches. The Crown Prince listened politely, asked strategic questions, and made non-committal promises to consider all proposals thoroughly. The atmosphere was professional but cold. Business was business, nothing more. Then came the lunch break. Delegates mingled in small groups, discussing market trends and exchanging business cards. The Saudi officials moved through the crowd like gracious hosts, ensuring everyone felt welcomed but maintaining the careful distance that power requires. It was during this intermission that Ibrahim Traoré finally made his appearance. He was nothing like what the room expected. At 35, he was younger than most CEOs present, but carried himself with a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. Unlike every other delegate, he wasn't wearing a Western business suit. Instead, He wore his nation's traditional military dress uniform, not as a costume or cultural display, but as a statement of identity and pride. The fabric wasn't expensive, the tailoring wasn't perfect, but something about his presence commanded respect. The conversations gradually quieted as people noticed him. Here was a man who clearly didn't belong in this world of billion-dollar deals and champagne networking, yet somehow seemed completely comfortable in his own skin. He didn't rush to introduce himself to influential figures or hand out business cards like confetti. He simply stood quietly, observing, waiting for his moment. When the afternoon sessions resumed, Traoré was scheduled to speak last. By that time of day, most delegates were already thinking about dinner plans and evening flights. The Crown Prince had sat through hours of presentations, his attention visibly waning despite his diplomatic politeness. Several attendees had already begun checking their phones and whispering about early departures. Then the moderator announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." The polite applause was noticeably lukewarm. This was clearly viewed as the day's obligatory gesture toward African inclusion, a box to check rather than a serious business opportunity. Even the Crown Prince seemed to settle back in his chair with the resigned patience of someone enduring a necessary formality. Traoré walked to the podium with measured steps. He carried no laptop, no presentation remote, no stack of documents. No slideshow appeared on the massive screens flanking the stage. Instead, he simply stood there for a moment, making eye contact with different sections of the audience. The silence stretched just long enough to become noticeable, just long enough to make people lean forward slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but carried clearly through the hall without amplification. "Your Royal Highness," he began, "distinguished delegates, I have a question for you. When you close your eyes and imagine the future, what do you see?" The room stirred slightly. This wasn't the usual opening. No gratitude for the invitation. No praise for Saudi hospitality. No demographic statistics about Burkina Faso. Do you see taller buildings, faster computers, more efficient machines? Traoré continued. Or do you see human beings standing a little straighter, walking a little prouder, dreaming a little bigger? Crown Prince bin Salman's eyebrows raised almost imperceptibly. This was definitely not a standard investment pitch. Traoré stepped away from the podium, moving closer to his audience. For the past 6 hours, I've listened to brilliant minds discuss market penetration, profit margins, and return on investment. All important metrics, all necessary calculations, but I've heard very little about the one resource that actually creates wealth: human potential. He paused, letting that statement settle. "Your Highness, your kingdom has invested brilliantly across the globe. Silicon Valley startups, European manufacturing, Asian technology hubs. You've built partnerships with nations that already have wealth, infrastructure, and stability. But may I ask, when did you last invest in raw human hunger?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several delegates exchanged glances. This was beginning to feel less like a business presentation and more like a philosophical debate. "I come from a place most of you have never heard of," Traoré continued. "Burkina Faso, land of upright people. We have no oil reserves like our neighbors, no diamond mines like others, no vast coastlines for shipping. What we have is something far rarer in today's world. People who haven't yet learned that certain things are impossible." He reached into his jacket and withdrew something that made several people in the front row lean forward with curiosity. It was a small, weathered photograph. "This picture was taken 3 months ago in a village called Gango," he said, holding it up. "The boy in this photograph is 10 years old. His name is Musa. Until recently, he had never seen electric light. His village had no power grid, no generators, nothing. When the sun set, their world went dark." Traoré's voice remained steady, but something in his tone had shifted. 3 months ago, we installed our first community solar panel in Gango, not with foreign aid money, not with World Bank loans, with resources we generated ourselves through agricultural export reforms and mining efficiency improvements. And do you know what happened when that first light bulb illuminated Musa's home? The hall was completely silent now. Even the Crown Prince had stopped fidgeting with his tablet. He didn't celebrate. He didn't dance. He looked at his father and said, Now we can study after sunset. Now we can build something. 10 years old. And his first thought wasn't about entertainment or comfort. It was about productivity and construction. Traoré began walking slowly across the stage, his eyes moving from face to face. That photograph represents what I came here to discuss. Not charity, not aid, not development assistance. Partnership. Real partnership between nations that have capital and nations that have hunger. He stopped directly in front of the Crown Prince's table. Your Highness, you've spoken eloquently about diversifying Saudi Arabia's economy beyond oil dependence. You've invested in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, tourism, entertainment, all wise strategies. But may I suggest that your kingdom's greatest opportunity lies not in replacing oil with technology, but in replacing transactions with transformation. The boldness of this statement rippled through the room. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke to Crown Prince bin Salman this directly, especially not representatives from countries whose entire economies were smaller than Saudi Arabia's annual budget surplus. But Traoré wasn't finished. Africa isn't a continent asking for handouts. We're a continent offering partnership. 54 nations with over 1 billion people, most under the age of 25. The youngest, most energetic population on Earth, living on a land mass rich in minerals, arable land, and renewable energy potential. But here's what makes Africa different from other investment opportunities. We're still writing our story. He pulled out a tablet, the first technology he displayed, and projected a simple map onto the screen behind him. It showed the African continent with a series of dotted lines crisscrossing from west to east. This is a Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Corridor, he announced, a network of roads, railways, power lines, and communication systems connecting Dakar to Djibouti. 8,000 kilometers of coordinated development across 12 nations. The largest infrastructure project in African history, designed not by foreign consultants, but by African engineers, economists, and planners. The room's energy had completely shifted. People were sitting forward, phones were being set aside, and several delegates were taking notes. The total cost of this project is $800 million, Traoré continued. Less than Saudi Arabia spends on a single luxury resort development, but the impact will be transformational. Imagine connecting West Africa's agricultural abundance with East Africa's ports. Imagine solar farms in Sahara powering industrial centers from Senegal to Sudan. Imagine high-speed internet connecting African universities with global research networks. Crown Prince bin Salman was now leaning forward, his elbows on the table, his full attention focused on the presentation. But here's why this matters to Saudi Arabia specifically, Traoré said, returning to address the prince directly. This isn't just about African development. This is about positioning your kingdom as the bridge between continents. Every ton of cargo moving through this corridor could transit through Saudi ports. Every megawatt of energy could be supplemented by Saudi renewable technology. Every communication network could be enhanced by Saudi telecommunications investments. He clicked to the next slide, showing economic projections and trade flow estimates. Conservative estimates suggest this corridor would increase Saudi-African trade by 400% within a decade. But more importantly, it would establish Saudi Arabia not just as a regional power, but as a global connector, the nation that helped unite Africa with Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The presentation was becoming more technical now, with detailed financial models and implementation timelines, but Traoré kept returning to his central theme: partnership rather than patronage, investment rather than charity, transformation rather than transaction. Your Highness, he said, advancing to his final slide, every great kingdom in history is remembered not for what it accumulated, but for what it built. The Egyptians built pyramids. The Romans built roads. The British built ships. What will Saudi Arabia build? He clicked off the presentation and returned to center stage. I propose that Saudi Arabia build bridges. Not physical bridges, human bridges, economic bridges. Bridges between the world's youngest continent and its most ambitious kingdom. The room was electric with attention. Now, this was no longer the polite endurance of a minor nation's pitch. This was a serious policy proposal with real strategic implications. But then Traoré did something completely unexpected. He closed his tablet, stepped back from the microphone, and began speaking without any technological support at all. However, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall, I must be completely honest with you. I didn't come here primarily to ask for your investment. A murmur of confusion rippled through the audience. Crown Prince bin Salman's expression sharpened with interest. I came here to offer you something far more valuable than a business opportunity. Traoré continued. I came to offer you a place in history. Not as a kingdom that got rich from oil, but as a kingdom that helped other nations get rich from their own resources. Not as a country that bought influence, but as a country that built influence through partnership and respect. He paused, letting this distinction sink in. The Trans-Sahel corridor will be built with or without Saudi participation. My country and our neighbors have already committed to making this happen. We have Chinese partners interested, European investors inquiring, and American corporations studying feasibility. We don't need rescue, we need partnership. The boldness of this statement was breathtaking. Here was a representative from one of the world's poorest countries, essentially telling one of the world's richest countries that their participation was welcome but not essential. But Traoré continued, if Saudi Arabia chooses to join this project, you won't just be investing in infrastructure. You'll be investing in the future of South-South cooperation. You'll be demonstrating that wealth is most powerful when it creates more wealth, not when it simply accumulates more wealth. He began walking toward the Crown Prince's table again, but this time his approach felt less like a presentation and more like a conversation between equals. Your Highness, you've spoken about Vision 2030 and Saudi Arabia's transformation into a global hub. But imagine Vision 2050, Saudi Arabia as a nation that helped transform an entire continent. Imagine Saudi companies not just operating in Africa, but growing with Africa. Imagine Saudi students studying in African universities that Saudi investment helped build. Imagine African students researching in Saudi laboratories that African minerals helped construct. The vision he was painting was expansive, ambitious, and completely different from the traditional donor-recipient relationship that usually characterized North-South economic partnerships. This is why I didn't prepare a PowerPoint presentation asking for money, Traoré said. This is why I didn't bring a delegation of consultants with financial projections. This is why I came alone, speaking as one leader to another, offering partnership between equals. He stopped directly in front of the Crown Prince, close enough for a private conversation, but speaking loudly enough for the entire room to hear. Your Highness, I believe that Saudi Arabia's greatest achievement won't be the tallest building or the fastest train or the most advanced artificial intelligence. Your greatest achievement will be proving that true power lies not in dominating markets, but in creating markets, not in controlling resources, but in developing resources, not in buying loyalty, but in earning respect. The room was absolutely silent. This was either the most impressive diplomatic presentation anyone had witnessed or the most spectacular career suicide in modern international relations. Crown Prince bin Salman sat motionless for several long seconds, his expression unreadable. The tension was palpable. Every delegate in the room understood they were witnessing a pivotal moment that could either launch a revolutionary partnership or end in diplomatic embarrassment. Finally, the Crown Prince spoke. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent hall. President Traoré, he said, in the past 5 years, I have heard thousands of investment pitches. I have been presented with countless opportunities, proposals, and partnerships. Most of them focus on what Saudi Arabia could provide, our capital, our markets, our strategic location, our influence. He paused, his eyes locked on Traoré. You are the first person to focus on what Saudi Arabia could become. The Crown Prince stood slowly, his movement causing a ripple of attention throughout the room. When he reached his full height, he continued speaking, but now he was addressing not just Traoré, but the entire assembly. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have just witnessed is precisely the kind of thinking that will define the next century of global development. President Traoré hasn't asked us to solve Africa's problems. He has invited us to participate in Africa's solutions. He began walking around his table, moving closer to where Traoré stood. This is exactly the kind of partnership that Vision 2030 was designed to create. Relationships based on mutual benefit, shared growth, and respect for each partner's contributions. The Crown Prince stopped directly in front of Traoré, close enough that their conversation became personal rather than public, though everyone in the room strained to hear every word. "Mr. President," he said, "your Trans-Sahel infrastructure corridor represents precisely the kind of transformational investment that Saudi Arabia wants to support, not because we see Africa as a charity case, but because we see Africa as a partner in building the world's economic future." He turned to address the broader audience. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund will commit $500 million to the first phase of the Trans-Sahel infrastructure corridor, with additional commitments contingent on project milestones and partner nation participation. The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. Several delegates audibly gasped. This wasn't just a significant financial commitment. It represented a fundamental shift in how Saudi Arabia approached African partnerships. But the Crown Prince wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, Saudi Arabia will establish a permanent African partnership office in Riyadh, dedicated specifically to identifying and developing South-South cooperation opportunities. President Traoré, I would like to invite you to chair the advisory board for this new initiative. The offer was unprecedented. African leaders were typically invited to Saudi Arabia as supplicants or ceremony participants, never as strategic partners in designing Saudi policy. Traoré accepted with a simple nod, but his eyes conveyed the magnitude of what had just occurred. This wasn't just about money or infrastructure. It was about dignity, respect, and the recognition that partnership could be more powerful than patronage. Your Highness, Traoré replied, this partnership will be remembered as a moment when the Global South truly began cooperating rather than competing. When wealth became a tool for creating wealth rather than simply accumulating wealth. The Crown Prince smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure he'd shown all day. Mr. President, I believe you're absolutely right, and I believe this partnership will benefit both our nations far more than either of us can currently imagine. The formal session concluded with polite applause, but the real energy was in the private conversations that followed. Delegates from other African nations immediately approached Traoré, eager to understand how their countries might participate in this new framework. European and American representatives began calculating how the Saudi-African partnership might affect their own continental relationships. But the most significant development happened away from the cameras and microphones. As delegates began filing out of the conference hall, Crown Prince bin Salman approached Traoré for a private conversation. Mr. President, he said quietly, I want you to know that your presentation today wasn't just impressive, it was necessary. Saudi Arabia has been looking for authentic partnerships rather than transactional relationships. You've shown us what that actually looks like. Traoré nodded appreciatively. Your Highness, Burkina Faso has learned that dignity is more valuable than charity and partnership is more powerful than patronage. Today proved that these principles can actually work in practice, not just in theory. The Crown Prince extended his hand for a handshake that felt less like diplomatic protocol and more like the beginning of a genuine alliance. Mr. President, I believe this is the beginning of something transformational for both our regions. As news of the partnership spread beyond the conference walls, the response was immediate and dramatic. African stock markets surged as investors recognized the implications of Saudi-backed infrastructure development. Social media exploded with commentary about the new model of international cooperation. Young Africans posted clips of Traoré's presentation with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like," and finally, "Someone speaking as an equal." International media coverage was extensive but divided. Western outlets focused primarily on the geopolitical implications, how the Saudi-African partnership might affect European and American influence on the continent. Chinese media emphasized the competition aspects, noting that this development could complicate China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. Middle Eastern publications celebrated the partnership as evidence of Saudi Arabia's growing global leadership. But perhaps the most significant response came from other African leaders. Within 48 hours of the Riyadh announcement, presidents and prime ministers from across the continent were reaching out to both Saudi Arabia and Burkina Faso, eager to participate in this new framework for international cooperation. The president of Senegal called to discuss connecting Dakar to the Trans-Sahel corridor. The prime minister of Ethiopia inquired about extending the network to connect with existing Chinese-built infrastructure. Even South Africa's leadership began exploring how their more developed economy could contribute to the Continental Project. What made this response particularly remarkable was its authenticity. These weren't the usual diplomatic pleasantries or obligatory expressions of support. These were serious inquiries from leaders who recognized that something fundamental had shifted in how African nations could engage with global partners. Back in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, the reaction was electric. Citizens gathered around radios and television sets to hear news of their president's diplomatic triumph. For a nation that had grown accustomed to being ignored or patronized by international partners, seeing their leader treated as an equal by one of the world's most powerful kingdoms was profoundly meaningful. But Traoré himself remained focused on implementation rather than celebration. In interviews following his return from Riyadh, he consistently emphasized that the real work was just beginning. A handshake in Saudi Arabia means nothing if we can't deliver results in Africa, he told reporters. Partnership is proven through performance, not promises. This practical approach characterized everything that followed. Rather than staging elaborate ceremonies or announcing unrealistic timelines, Traoré's government began the methodical work of turning diplomatic success into developmental progress. The first concrete step was establishing the Trans-Sahel Coordination Office in Ouagadougou, staffed jointly by Burkinabe officials and Saudi technical advisors. Their mandate was simple but ambitious: transform the infrastructure corridor from concept to reality within 5 years. The Saudi commitment proved to be more than symbolic. Within 3 months of the Riyadh meeting, Saudi engineers were conducting feasibility studies across the Sahel region. Saudi construction companies were bidding on preliminary contracts. Saudi banks were establishing correspondent relationships with African financial institutions. But perhaps most importantly, the partnership maintained its emphasis on equality and mutual benefit. Rather than simply funding African projects with Saudi money, the collaboration involved genuine knowledge transfer and capacity building. African engineers worked alongside Saudi specialists. African economists contributed to project planning. African companies were prioritized for construction contracts. This approach had profound implications beyond the immediate project. For decades, African development had been characterized by dependency relationships, either with former colonial powers, Cold War superpowers, or emerging economies like China. The Saudi partnership represented something genuinely different: a relationship between developing nations based on complementary strengths rather than hierarchical dependencies. The impact extended far beyond economics. Young Africans began seeing international relations differently, not as something that happened to them, but as something they could actively shape. Universities across the continent began offering new programs in South-South cooperation and diplomatic strategy. African think tanks started producing research on alternative models of international partnership. 6 months after the Riyadh meeting, the first section of the Trans-Sahel Corridor broke ground in a ceremony that was deliberately modest but symbolically powerful. Rather than flying an international dignitary for a lavish celebration, the groundbreaking featured local community leaders, regional engineers, and workers who would actually build the infrastructure. Traoré's speech at the ceremony captured the significance of the moment. Today, we don't just break ground for a road. We break ground for a new model of how nations can work together. We prove that partnership is more powerful than patronage, that dignity is more valuable than charity, and that the Global South can write its own story of development and prosperity. The road construction proceeded efficiently, with Saudi technical expertise combining with African labor and resources to produce results that exceeded initial projections. More importantly, the project generated significant employment opportunities for local communities while building genuine technical capacity that would outlast a specific infrastructure development. As the first year of the partnership concluded, its success had become undeniable. The Trans-Sahel Corridor was ahead of schedule and under budget. African-Saudi trade had increased by 60%. Most significantly, the partnership had inspired similar collaborations between other Global South nations. Brazil began exploring infrastructure partnerships with Nigeria. India increased its engagement with East African technology sectors. Mexico established new trade relationships with North African manufacturing centers. The Saudi African model was spreading, creating a network of South-South partnerships that were reshaping global economic relationships. But the true measure of the partnership's success wasn't in statistics or trade figures. It was in the fundamental shift in how nations approached international cooperation. The traditional model of wealthy nations providing aid to poor nations was being supplemented by a new model of developing nations partnering with each other based on complementary strengths and mutual respect. Crown Prince bin Salman reflected on this transformation during a speech marking the first anniversary of the Riyadh meeting. President Traoré taught us that true leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions. He didn't ask us to solve Africa's problems. He invited us to participate in Africa's solutions. That invitation has transformed not just our relationship with Africa, but our understanding of what partnership actually means. For his part, Traoré remained characteristically focused on results rather than recognition. When asked about his diplomatic success, he consistently emphasized the collective nature of the achievement. This partnership succeeded because it was based on truth rather than flattery, on mutual benefit rather than one-sided charity, and on respect rather than pity. Those principles can work anywhere between any nations if leaders have the courage to embrace them. The story of that day in Riyadh had become more than a diplomatic anecdote. It had become a model for how international relations could evolve in the 21st century. It proved that dignity and partnership weren't just moral ideals, but practical strategies that could produce better results than traditional aid and dependency relationships. As the Trans-Sahel corridor neared completion of its first phase, its impact was already visible. New businesses were emerging along the route. Educational opportunities were expanding in connected communities. Most importantly, young Africans were seeing their continent differently, not as a place that needed to be rescued, but as a place that was actively building its own future. The partnership between Saudi Arabia and Burkina Faso had started with one man's refusal to ask for charity and his insistence on offering partnership instead. It had grown into a model that was inspiring similar collaborations across the global South and redefining how nations could work together in an interconnected world. And in Gango, that small village where the story began, 10-year-old Musa was now studying by electric light, dreaming of becoming an engineer, and growing up in a world where African leadership was reshaping international relations. The boy in the photograph had become a symbol of what was possible when partnership replaced patronage, when dignity trumped charity, and when leaders had the courage to demand respect rather than simply hoping for sympathy. The transformation was complete, but the impact was just beginning.